You ever wonder why it is that if God exists, there is no proof or even strong evidence for his existence? Well, inspiring philosophy has an interesting explanation.
If God was a tangible being on the planet, with all his power and glory, you would worship him and be obedient to his laws because you'd be afraid of him and be afraid of being sent to hell for being disobedient. You would only be good because you'd be afraid that God might punish you. Your entire motivation for being good would not be because you love God or were thankful for what he did for you on the cross. You would be good because you would be worried about yourself. In other words, you wouldn't be good for goodness sake or for God's sake. You would be good for your own sake. And that's the problem, because that's the mindset that sends people to hell.
Do you really think that if God were visible, everyone would go to hell? Not a single person would see God and become a God fanboy? And besides, if fearing God were a bad thing, why do I always hear Christians and Jews saying that fearing God is a virtue or that it's the beginning of wisdom? Although I will say that if this argument worked, it would be a good one to make against Pascal's wager, which says you ought to believe in God precisely because it is in your own self-interest to do so. It would also be a good argument to make against the fire and brimstone preachers. I think IP's theology is wonky, but I wish more Christians subscribed to it. Because if they did, maybe you wouldn't hear them saying that God will send tornadoes to states that ban teaching creationism and legalize gay marriage. After all, God wants you to teach creationism for its own sake, not because you fear his wrath. But why does God smite so many people for disobeying him? If God wanted you to love him rather than fear him and do good for its own sake, you'd think that punishing people with divine retribution would be counterproductive. Why is it that actually showing proof of his existence would be too scary and would make people follow God out of fear instead of love, but sending plagues and pestilence as punishment for some reason does not have that effect?
And if God was a visible being on the planet, you'd be utterly filled with fear.
You'd think the fact that God is the greatest being possible would inspire more enthusiasm than fear. If Satan suddenly showed up, there would be at least a few people who would be like, that guy looks fucking awesome. But if God showed up, you think nobody would have that reaction? That sounds a bit counterintuitive to me. What if you already believed in God? Would people who already believed that God exists suddenly have a fear that they didn't have before, thus rendering them ineligible for salvation? Why would that be the case?
Many people have a misconception about the path to heaven. They think it's just living a good life and following all the rules. So if God was real, he should make his presence known, so I'll know that heaven and hell exist and I can follow all of God's commandments. But when people do that, the heart doesn't change. You're still self-absorbed, because your attitude becomes, I'm doing good, I'm working hard, so God has to bless me. And you're only thinking of yourself. You are using your moral deeds to force God to bless you.
In that case, wouldn't at least some of the people most deserving of heaven be the ones who don't even believe in it? If God really wants to reward people who do good for the sake of doing good rather than for the sake of the afterlife, then atheists who do good are the ones most likely to fit that description. When atheists do good things, they don't fear hell, nor do they hope to get into heaven. If God wanted people to do good for its own sake, he shouldn't have even told people about heaven and hell. In fact, the best strategy might even be to not let anyone on earth know he even exists. That way, people would be the least likely to do good for the purpose of sucking up to God.